Hey everyone, this is Cortland Dahl. So great to be back with you all again. Got a rainy day here, so hopefully you can't hear the rain too much and you can hear me clearly. But it's great to be here with you all. For those of you who I haven't met or who haven't tuned into any of these live streams before, as I mentioned, my name is Cortland. I'm one of the instructors in the Tergar community. And one of the cast of characters that leads the guided meditations and offers these streaming sessions. So thank you so much for joining. It looks like there's people from all over the world. Feel free to chime in on the chat here and let us know where you're from. Looks like we have Anton from London, Maura from Iowa in the US, Germany, California, Sweden, Finland, New Mexico, Paris. Great. So wonderful to see you all. So here we are. We're now, how long has it been? I don't know, 3-4 months into this global pandemic. So many new names pouring in. This is great. So it's strange. I've offered a few of these sessions, and you might have heard some of the other ones. And it's still this period of incredible uncertainty. It's starting to almost feel normal that we have this new world that we're living in, where many of us are completely changing our lifestyle. And the topic for today, some of you might have tuned into Mingyur Rinpoche's talk on Sunday, where he gave another similar talk. But I thought today that we could talk a little bit about the incredible lessons that we're all learning individually, the lessons that we're learning collectively, and how we can actually use these moments of incredible adversity, all of the uncertainty, all the change, everything that is happening in the world right now, how we might be able to actually learn some really important lessons, not only for ourselves individually, but for ourselves as a species, for the whole of humanity, for the entirety of the planet. And this actually goes back to something very, very central in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which is this idea of using upheaval, of using periods of uncertainty and change like we have right now, of using these as moments to wake up. And there's a principle that you might have heard about. The Tibetan term is bardo, which literally just means a gap. It's a period where something is changing, sometimes in a huge way, sometimes in a more subtle way, but there's some kind of shift. And there's the period in which we are shifting from one paradigm to another, or from one experience to another. And it's in that gap, in between, when that uncertainty, the change, when the transition is actually happening, that there are these moments where we can begin to wake up. So these are incredibly potent moments, and this idea of a bardo, or this gap in our experience, is said to be one of the most transformative moments if we can learn to tune into that. If we can learn to see it clearly, we can see that this change, this moment has opened our experience up in some way. And then within that opening, we can see with new eyes. We can take a fresh perspective on what it means to be human, what it means to live a rich, fulfilling life, that even these challenging moments, and certainly we're in the middle of one right now, that actually, if we look back on the big scope of our lives, it is actually usually these moments, sometimes incredibly difficult moments, when we really learn and grow. And in particular, those moments where we come a little bit closer to the fragility of life. Perhaps in this case, even close to the thought of death. We might have people who are close to us who have been ill. We ourselves might be ill. The whole of humanity is a little bit more aware of the fragility of life right now. And that can be a frightening thing. It can be a terrifying thing. But opening up to the fragility of life, if we can shift our perspective, can also open us up to the preciousness of life. And when we see that preciousness of the opportunity that we have in the life, in the bodies we have, in the lives and circumstances we have, even when they're challenging. If we can see that preciousness, then we can start this path of learning and growth and transformation that can completely change everything about our lives. So this is really what this idea of bardo is all about in Tibetan Buddhism. It's using the upheaval as an opportunity to wake up. So rather than starting this session with a long guided meditation, I thought I'd do this a little bit differently. There's 3 lessons that have really been front and center for me in my life, and my guess is for some, if not all of you, or maybe 1 or 2 of these have been coming up for you. And I thought we could go through each of these one by one and do a little bit of meditation with each of these to show how we can use meditation practice as a way to bring this fresh perspective, to open up to this fragility, to this uncertainty in such a way that we actually can see the preciousness within that. So the 3 lessons that to me have been really front and center are, first, how incredibly interconnected we are. How interconnected we are with each other, how interconnected we are with our environment, how interconnected we are with even other forms of life, and how much that in our normal day-to-day life, we oftentimes have these blinders on where it feels like we are cut off, we're independent, we're these sort of individual entities just bumping up against each other. And this is just helping us see that we are so much more interconnected than we normally see. So that's the first one, this idea of interdependence, as Buddhists refer to it, or you might simply say, seeing these interconnections that we all share more clearly. The second one is simply about the importance of compassion. That compassion is really not a luxury, it's a necessity at this point. We, especially for those of us who've grown up in cultures that are more capitalistic, we grew up with this narrative of competitiveness. You got to get your own, a zero-sum game, and this idea that we were kind of all on our own and we need to do it on our own. I think we're starting to see that as a paradigm just does not work, that we really need a reset at a global level, and it needs to be rooted in compassion. It needs to be rooted in care. So that's the second one. First is connection, second is compassion. And the third one that we'll talk about today is about this shift from doing to being. And this is yet another one that this upheaval and all this change, everything we're seeing is bringing into relief, is showing us a little bit more clearly, is that we have just been moving at hyperspeed, really for decades and decades, almost unlike most times throughout human history where there was a culture and rituals of being. We have lost so much of that. We have become cultures of endless, habitual, obsessive doing, to the point where it's almost an addiction. Like we don't even know how to stop. And I feel like the world, the universe, is just giving us this painful wake-up call right now, just saying, slow down. You need to make space for being. Doing is not the only essential there is in life. So there's a real kind of loss of balance. So we're going to move through these one by one, but why don't we start by doing a little practice together. This first one on this idea of interdependence or interconnections, and we can bring this into our experience, and then you can all share a bit of your experience and your thoughts, and I'll say a few words. So why don't we take a moment to settle in. Feel free to find a posture that feels comfortable and upright, but most importantly, that feels relaxed. You can close your eyes if you find that helpful, or leave them gently open. Take a few slow, deep breaths and notice how you feel right now. And perhaps notice some things about your experience that you might typically miss. Perhaps something going on in your body or in the world around you. Just bring some curiosity and appreciation to your experience here in this moment. And now notice what is shaping and influencing your experience in this moment. We tend to think of there being a me and then the rest of the world. But see if you can loosen the boundaries of this rigid sense of self. And notice how in this moment, the you right now is simply the sum total of all of these different experiences. So notice how what you're taking in through the senses, what you see and hear and feel, how that is part of the you of this moment. Can you really separate all of these experiences from the you that experiences them? You don't need to think about this, simply feel, listen, observe all these experiences and see that your sense of self in this moment is all of these experiences. And now notice what's moving through your mind. Your attention might be moving here and there. Thoughts, memories, impressions. And again, all of that is shaping, forming, and reforming your sense of self in each moment. So now just notice all of these experiences playing out on the screen of awareness and how that shapes your sense of self in this moment. And now let's widen the scope even further. Think about all of the different people and experiences that have led you to this moment. So the fact that you've tuned in here suggests that you must be, at least have some curiosity or interest in meditation or Buddhism or some of these ideas and practices. What influences shaped that very intention that brought you here? Perhaps you read a book or had a conversation, or somebody else sparked your interest. What are those influences? And similarly, your ancestors, your family. So many people, so many generations have shaped the you of this moment. So take a moment to reflect on all these people throughout your family, generations and ancestors. Any one of those person didn't exist, and perhaps you wouldn't exist. Take a moment to appreciate that and notice that deep sense of connections with our family and lineage. And now let go. Again, drop back into this present moment of experience. Notice everything that's happening within you and around you. And see if you can just sense a way of being that is not feeling cut off or isolated, but rather seeing that you are this deep, unique set of interconnections between all of these experiences and relationships playing out in this moment and many other moments. And just relax into that sense of interconnectedness. Just be that interconnectedness. Even in the most simple act, for example, taking a breath, so many things make that possible. So many things and people and experiences have led to this breath in this moment. So we can breathe, but breathing while being fully immersed in that sense of being deeply connected to others and the world and our history. So you can slowly open your eyes if they were closed. And take a moment just to look around. Notice some of the small details that you might not normally see. But again, here with a sense of connection, a sense of appreciation or warmth even for all of this richness that plays out in each moment of our lives. So feel free if you'd like to share something, if you want to mention in the chat here anything that came to you, some of these experiences or people or moments that have shaped your life and shaped even this present moment in some way, if you want to share what came up in that. It was really interesting for me, as some of you might reflect on that and want to share in the chat something that came up in the meditation. I'll share something that came up to me, which was quite unexpected. When we talked, or I gave you that prompt to think about lineage and family and ancestors and history, I thought of a number of different things. But it immediately, or one of the first figures that came to me actually was my grandma, Sue. And actually both my grandmas were artists, and one of them passed away when I was quite young. But one, my grandma Sue, I spent a great deal of time with as a kid, and she was an artist, and everything I did with her was about art. Her whole perspective was infused with art, and I just had these precious memories of just walking through the forest and with seeing the world through her eyes, which was always looking for things we could find and kind of make into some kind of work of art. And it suddenly occurred to me, it's not something I think about that much. Of course, I have warm memories of her. She's passed away a number of years ago. But it suddenly occurred to me that actually that view as an artist and being so immersed in that and all the time I spent with her has shaped me even now, that in some way that presence, her presence in my own experience, in my mind, is still alive in me, and that some of the creativity, and I might not be doing art in the same way, but some of that same creative perspective very much shapes my experience. And so I'm just giving this as an example because that influence is always there. It's not as though I created that in my mind, but somehow seeing it clearly really made me feel more deeply connected, in this case to her, to my family, to my ancestors, and so on. So I see some of you sharing some of your thoughts. So people appreciating the beauty that we see. Somebody else, Anton, mentioned that your grandma was coming up frequently. That's really sweet. So it's interesting. And actually, another point that's coming up here, which is quite common, some of you are asking about other experiences. Sometimes we might sit down to open up to, in this case, to a sense of connectedness, but then we might find resentment. We might find tension. We might find anger. We might find sadness. The first thing I would say about that is that that's a completely normal thing to have that response. In fact, it's a very healthy thing. Part of what's happening here, as I mentioned earlier, is that we're opening up this space. We're opening up space in our heart. We're opening up space in our mind. And we're learning to see everything that's there churning beneath the surface, but that we don't normally see so clearly. So allowing that resentment and sadness or whatever it might be to come up is a really, really powerful part of the practice. And it relates to what we'll talk about later with the idea of shifting into being, because the doing doesn't give us the space for that. But part of what we just did is just open up. We dropped into a more receptive space, a space of being, and then all of this stuff can begin to emerge. So we don't need to stop the resentment or the sadness or the anger. Part of it, with this particular lens, we could look at it through the lens of being or through compassion, and we'll talk about that later. But if you take something like resentment, which is something that a few of you mentioned, when that arises, and you might, an emotion or a person or an experience comes to mind, and maybe you feel that resentment really intensely. One way to look at that is not to push it away, but yet also not to get hooked by it, not to get completely carried away by it, but instead simply to get curious about it. And one very, very simple principle here is to view everything that happens in your mind and your body as a teacher. Everything has something to teach us. So in this case, it might be looking into that sense of resentment, not with the sense of wanting to fix it or improve it or get rid of it, but what's going on there? Part of it was probably I was hurt at some point. And that resentment was kind of a protective mechanism because part of me didn't feel heard or seen or valued in some way. So part of it is just allowing that to come out and say, oh, this was just my coping mechanism. This was the armor that I put on myself in this experience because I didn't know how to cope with simply being hurt or being vulnerable. We then might look deeper through the lens of interconnectedness here. What are all the things that are shaping that experience? What is the experience of resentment actually like in this moment? Is it a feeling in the body? Are there thoughts playing out in my mind? Are there memories? And again, it's not with the intention to change or fix any of that, but really just opening up that space and digging deeply into it. There's also a related point that's super, super important here, which is it's really critical to know, to have a healthy boundary around when it is productive and constructive and it feels workable to enter into some of that difficult space, and when we might need to actually step back and say, okay, right now I'm just overwhelmed. This is too much. I'm going to take a break. In some cases, you might be meditating. Taking a break from meditation might actually be the right step. And it certainly is if we're getting overwhelmed by something or really triggered. Just take a break, go for a walk, have a chat with a friend, and so on. So I see a lot of different comments in here. I think a lot of what's coming up reading through these is that we can have these moments, some of you talking about, where we can feel this deep sense of connection. But then there's, in this space, there can be a lot of grief. There can be fear. There can be a sense of powerlessness. I think that's one thing that it's easy to feel at a time like this, where the challenge just feels so overwhelming. And in some cases, we might have entire societal systems. So for those of you who live in the United States, you probably have been hearing about what happened in Minneapolis, where an African-American man was killed by the police. And I'm from Minneapolis, so this really hits close to home. And it can sometimes feel like these social systems, it's more than one individual and a few people with malicious intent. Somehow the whole system just seems irrevocably, irrevocably, sorry for my pronunciation. It just feels like the whole thing is broken. And what could we possibly do to even influence, much less remedy that? So it's certainly true that these are very, very complex problems. And sitting and meditating is not going to solve every problem on the planet. But one thing that it can do, and I think that is certain, is that feeling a stronger sense of connection and learning to see that even with the people we don't agree with, even with the people that might actually be harming other people, to see their humanity, to not justify their behavior, but to really radically start seeing the humanity in each other and how we're all fumbling through this and trying to figure it out. That is sort of an essential starting point. And this is not to justify any harmful behavior, but just as a starting point to see that we all make mistakes, sometimes horrible mistakes that need to be addressed. Sometimes we just say something wrong or something unskillful, and there's everything in between on the spectrum. So there is no influence, although it's so easy to feel powerless in this. What this teaching on the interconnectedness that binds us all, the interconnectedness that we all share, teaches us is that actually there is no other way to influence things than simply to realize that we are part of that web, and then to know that we have a responsibility in our sphere, in the areas that we are influencing, that we can send out a little vibration that can ripple through that entire web. And the social system, the big systemic stuff, is nothing more than all of these little nodes and all the connections we all share. So a good example of this is, I would say, I don't even know when this was, maybe 10, 15 years ago, with the legalization of marijuana and gay marriage, where it seemed like it felt like one day where it felt like this is never going to change. This is never, like, somehow the forces of society are so entrenched against some of these things that is never going to change. It's just, I can't see it in my lifetime. And somehow within a period of months or a year, we have clearly so much work to do, but somehow something shift. It was almost enough vibrations got, spread out through that web of interconnections that the whole system really did begin to shift more radically than I think a lot of us thought was possible. So what this should teach us, I think, is that it's possible to change these things, even when we feel totally powerless, and that these moments where we take time to root ourselves in compassion, when we take time to feel empathy, even and especially for the people who we don't want to feel empathy for, the people who we don't want to let into our little club of care and compassion. If we can do that, and enough people start doing that, anything is possible. In fact, The real societal shifts that have happened throughout history are really the sum total of all that happening. We remember Gandhi, but Gandhi wasn't just some guy all on his own. He was working with millions of people, millions and millions of people. Susan B. Anthony here in the United States, and women having the right to vote. That, we remember the one person, but it was never one person. It was the web. The one person that we remember just helps us make sense of something that is so mind-bogglingly complex that our minds usually can't get around it, we can't wrap our heads around it. So what we just did, even if it's bringing up resentment and fear or any other reaction, what we just did in opening up to all those connections is part of seeing our relationship, our part in that web, and seeing that in many ways we are the web. We're just sort of one little node in this set of interconnections. But we are not isolated. We are not powerless. We are not cut off from everything. In fact, there is nothing else other than this incredibly complex web of interconnections. So that is one of the big lessons here, is that the pandemic we're facing right now, because the spread of this virus is helping us see. It's almost like a marker in a very harsh way, but it's just showing how deeply interconnected we are as a species. Beyond that, even with the entire planet. So we just dropped one little variable into this whole web, and it has rippled through the whole thing and changed everything. But that is only possible because we are so deeply interconnected. So even right now, if you look at this moment, you probably have this sense of you're there, you are this independent person watching me, I'm here speaking to a camera with a microphone, but the you in this moment is not separate from what you are seeing, from me, from your surroundings, from the hundreds of other people who are listening to this right now, right? We are all co-creating this moment, and our sense of self is being co-created in every moment, including this moment, by all of these influences. So it's not as though this sense of connection is some kind of woo-woo, kind of new agey idea. That is the reality. It's the sense of being this isolated, independent entity that is the illusion. And that's where we live most of our lives. So another element of this, another, you could say, kind of partner to this insight about being interconnected, is the importance of compassion. Because just having that set of interconnections and seeing it clearly, that alone is quite powerful. But we can use that interconnectedness for ill or for good. We can send out a ripple effect, a set of vibrations through that web that's going to be helpful and foster well-being and connection and compassion, or we can do one that's going to make us feel more isolated, that's going to make us feel more divided, that it's going to make us feel more angry and resentful, or whatever it might be. So this is another one that I think the world is kind of shaking us awake to right now, is how important it is that we infuse this web of relationship that we are all part of with compassion. And I don't mean compassion by having some warm, fuzzy feeling all the time. We might have some warm, fuzzy feeling. By compassion, I mean the wish, the intention, the motivation for all beings to be safe, to experience well-being, to be happy, to not suffer. And how we feel is really not the central thing here. It's that orientation. It is that heartfelt orientation to the well-being of others. So we can infuse that into this web of connection. So why don't we pause for a moment again and take another few minutes for a little bit of compassion practice this time, and then we can come back and revisit what this was like. So let's do this another few minutes here, like we did before. If you want to take a moment to check in with your posture, make sure you're feeling comfortable, upright, and relaxed. And really listen to your body here. If it feels natural to close your eyes, go ahead and do that. If you want to take a few slow, deep breaths and that feels helpful, go ahead and do that. Just listen to what your body and mind need in this moment. And as you do this, see if you can notice and recognize in this very simple act of bringing awareness to this moment that you are also bringing care and compassion to the front and center of your mind right now. You are caring for yourself. So do that right now. You're already doing that, but see that as compassion. You are expressing care for yourself, even in something as simple as taking a few deep breaths. And now perhaps think of other things in your life, other ways that you care for yourself, things that nourish you in some way, revitalize you, that help you feel grounded. Take a moment to reflect on those things that you do to care for yourself. And again, see these as the movement of compassion. And now let's see if we can widen that circle of compassion step by step. So take a moment to see if you can express in some way, either noticing things you already do, or through simply affirming your wish for others to experience well-being and to be free from suffering. So think of people in your life, perhaps people you care for, friends, family members. Bring them to mind. And again, think of things that you do to show your compassion and reaffirm your commitment to caring for these people in the same way that you care for yourself and they care for you. And now extend that even further to people you might not know as well, people who you might not consider as part of that circle of family and friends. This could be people you see in your daily routine, or it could be people on the other side of the world that you might never know or interact with. And just find small ways to extend and express compassion and kindness and care in whatever way resonates with you. If it helps, you can think of a short phrase. May you all be happy and free from suffering, or whatever phrase resonates. And now if you're feeling up to it, think even of people you might find challenging. It's really important that you not pick the most difficult person, unless you've been at this a long time. But perhaps somebody that just rubs you the wrong way, someone you might find a little annoying, and see if you can even imagine what it would be like to think about this person as inside your circle. What would it look like to feel compassion and care even for someone you don't like or you might find challenging? And now, to all beings, again, seeing yourself as just one little node on this incredibly vast web of interconnections. Send compassion to everyone, everywhere, all forms of life, without any limitation whatsoever. And now you can let go and relax. Just make some space for being. You don't even need to meditate, just sit, just rest your mind for a few moments. So this is a meditation practice, which I think my guess is like the one before. Feel free to chime in here if you want to share anything that came up for you in the chat. I'd love to hear what did come up. One thing to mention right at the outset, especially if these are new practices, these are lifetime practices. These are practices that are not necessarily meant to be easy. In some ways, they're actually meant to be hard. These are meant to push against the boundaries of our heart, the boundaries of our mind. And in this case, in this one, we might see that we do hit that boundary. We might have that aspiration that we want to have an open heart towards everyone and everything. And then we bring that one person to mind and we think, really? Him? Her? I have to let her in my club? And so that might be a long process in loosening up these boundaries and beginning to not exclude people from our own care and concern. Another piece of this, in the kind of the more lived embodiment of what we might do in our meditation practice, is not the boundaries in the sense of where do we kind of draw the circle, but having healthy boundaries in terms of how that manifests in our lives. And this is where wisdom and compassion always need to be in balance. Being compassionate doesn't mean that we're a doormat for the world. It doesn't mean we just indulge other people's neurotic behavior and let them do whatever they want to do, even if it's hurting us or hurting other people. In fact, if you go back to what I mentioned earlier about what compassion, at least in a Buddhist sense, refers to, which is wanting to people to be safe, to be free from suffering, wanting them to be well and experience well-being, that actually indulging harmful behavior is not helping the other person either. That's what in Buddhism they call idiot compassion. It's compassion devoid of wisdom. So there's always a balance here where we need to both have an open heart, but also a clear mind and to see clearly. So it's great to see some of these comments here. Actually, I see my aunt is on this call. Hello, Aunt Debbie. It's wonderful to have you here. So these are really powerful, and they're also really challenging precisely because they're meant to kind of push us beyond our comfort zone. And you can see so many places in the world where we draw these boundaries. We draw these boundaries between races. We draw these boundaries between religions. We draw these boundaries between cultures and countries. We draw these boundaries between economic class, between have and have not. We have all of these ways to divide ourselves. And all of that leads to essentially a failure of empathy, where we are no longer seeing other people as people, or other beings, not even human beings, other forms of life as worthy of respect, of worthy of being honored, just as we would like to be seen and valued and honored. So the more we have these rigid boundaries, the less we're seeing clearly everything that lies beyond that boundary. But part of that is simply seeing clearly and seeing how we deal with suffering, how we deal with harmful behavior, whether it's ours or someone else's, and noticing that compassion might sometimes not be a hug and a smile. It might be a strong word of saying, this isn't okay. You can say that as much for somebody who's being harmed as you can say that for the person who's doing the harming. Realizing that when there's something harmful that's happening, whether between people or even in a system, in a culture, that actually that isn't good for the people who are oppressing any more than it is for the people who are being oppressed. The whole system is a system of suffering in that case. So the wisdom is not just saying, oh, well, I'm being nice here and I just let them do whatever. It's simply seeing when at an individual level, a collective level, a societal level, when is that web operating in such a way that it's fostering suffering versus well-being? And how can we do our part to kind of ripple through that compassion and wisdom and clear seeing and humility, that we don't have all the answers. None of us, whether it's our religious perspective, our political perspective, our cultural view, none of us has a monopoly on the truth. We all need to be humble. We all need to stay open. So I think there's something in this compassion that is both humbling, but also empowering. It's humbling in the sense that we see we can't do this alone. We don't have any magic wand that we can wave here. But it's empowering in the sense that we can see that actually it is simply all of us together that are going to do anything about whatever the challenges we face are, right? So we need to do this together. We need to set boundaries together. We need to figure out wise action together. We need to name injustice when it's in front of us and work to address it together. That if you bring the first point about interconnectedness together with compassion, it's really that there's no way to do this other than as a huge team that has to break through a lot of these traditional boundaries. So let me say one last thing. We're coming towards the end of the time, but just a few words and a short practice on being, and then maybe I can end with a little bit of time for some Q&A because there's a lot of questions coming in. But let's talk a little bit about this last part because I think it impacts the first two in that when we're so obsessed with doing all of the time and we've erased all of our cultural rituals of being, it makes it so difficult to see clearly, to act wisely, and to stay grounded in compassion. So let's do this right now in a really simple way. Actually, I'll do a practice that for me has been one of the most helpful meditation practices to shift from doing to being, and it uses the breath. So take a moment. We'll just do this for a couple minutes here. Take a moment again, as we did before, to check in with your body, find a posture that suits you, and close your eyes if you like. And tune into the movement of your breath. But here in this practice, you don't need to focus intensely or concentrate. Simply know that you are breathing. And as you exhale, notice how your body and your mind naturally release and relax. There's a natural opening, very subtle, that occurs when we relax and exhale. And now especially tune into the short gap at the end of each out-breath. And allow yourself to drop into that space between the breaths and just rest there. There's nothing you need to do. It's more of simply letting go and letting be in that space between the breaths. Just rest there for a few moments for each cycle of breathing. And see if in this space you can allow that rigid sense of self that we carry with us through most of our lives. Just let that release a bit. Again, it's not something you need to do. It's only something you can allow. Allow your sense of self to expand, to become a little bit more fluid and less solid. And now even let go of the breath and simply, radically, unconditionally be. There is nothing that can happen in this moment that is not perfectly fine. Just allow everything to be as it is within you, around you in this moment. And now you can slowly open your eyes. Again, if you want to look around, notice some of these small details. So one of the most powerful things, one of the most powerful lessons, I think, that we're hearing these days is that we really need to make space for being in our individual lives, in our day, in our routines, but even as cultures and societies. In some cases, as is the case, I think, in the US, we've really done a pretty effective job of getting rid of most of these rituals that helped foster this sense of being. And in some parts of the world, they're still very much there. But I would say they're under threat, that there's more and more encroachment on this sort of a value system that actually prioritizes being, that at least puts it up alongside doing, if not in some cases even values it more. So, and Lisa actually just asked a question, a really important question, which comes up when we do this, which is what happens when we just let go and rest in these moments. But yet that inner activity doesn't slow down. The doing mind doesn't really cooperate with our invitation to be. This is a super, super important point. And the key is to let that happen. If the mind is super busy, that's what, to me, I oftentimes think of as the residue of doing. It's just the residue of the habit, the habitual pattern of all this activity that's going on all the time. So if that happens, let it happen. If your body feels stressed and agitated, allow your body to be stressed and agitated until it doesn't need to be stressed and agitated anymore. To try to get the mind to calm down or to get the body to be relaxed, that is injecting doing. That's trying to get to being through doing. But I can tell you through very long, painful experience, the only thing that's going to get you is more doing. It's sort of a mirage that can get us into being. So it's really just to say, oh, there's that old habit, the habit of thinking and thinking and thinking and doing and doing and doing. Ah, okay, well, I'm just going to let that play itself out in my experience. So just we're letting the whole system unwind. And it might take a minute, a month, a year, a decade for that unwinding to occur. And that's totally fine. So just making space for that. One thing that has come up in a bunch of topics or a bunch of questions that I want to address before we call this session to a close is really around boundaries and how we can keep an open heart. We can stay rooted in this sense of connectedness, which is fundamentally a state of intense vulnerability. And I think this is why it's so hard. It sounds wonderful to be very open-hearted. It sounds very wonderful to have this to see these connections and to be grounded in that sense of connectedness. But it feels like we're almost like we're naked in the world when that happens. It's a state of vulnerability. And there's a reason why we oftentimes protect ourselves from that. Because in the absence of any kind of more healthy coping mechanisms, it's overwhelming. And we can be open up to being hurt if we can't enter into that in a healthy way. So one thing is something that I mentioned earlier, which is just knowing our own threshold and knowing that we can hold the view and the aspiration to be open-hearted and to stay in this space of connectedness, but also to know that it is a path of getting there. Embodying that aspiration and co-creating that with so many other people, that's an aspiration. The path getting there is something that needs a lot of patience and a lot of wisdom. And sometimes the wise response is to say that right now, I'm leaving the room. I'm leaving the conversation. I'm leaving this relationship. That might be the right response in a moment. I'm not capable at this moment. I have the aspiration to stay open and in the state of connection. But right now, I'm not there yet. And in this particular context, I need to leave. The analogy I always give is an alcoholic. When you're first getting sober, if you just go straight into a bar where you've been drinking for the past decade and think you're going to get sober there, that's delusional. You need to know that the path to sobriety is saying, okay, right now, I can't be in that space. I can't be with those friends. The aspiration might be that later, I will feel so grounded in being sober that I could go back to that bar and I could talk to those people and I would be fine. But right now, I need space. Right now, I need a different set of influences on my experience in this moment. That is not only okay, that is actually the healthy step towards that bigger aspiration. So the only one who can answer this in any given moment is us. To simply know when are we over that boundary and that threshold, and when is it challenging, but it still feels workable. It still feels I can hang with it. I can stay with my practice, and it's really hard right now, but I can hang with it. So this can play out in many different ways with relationships, with physical issues. I've had similar things with my health, like I've had a heart condition, I think some of you know, and other health issues. And so there's always this boundary of where do we really kind of move into that space where it might be scary, but it's a really powerful, productive exploration. And where do we simply say, right now, I just need to take care of myself in a different way. And that's perfectly fine. So it's part of the wisdom of knowing that. So looks like we're at the top of the hour. So as I think most of you know, or you might be joining for the first time, if you are, then you'll probably know that we have lots of this stuff going on here in the Tergar YouTube channel. One thing I definitely would point you to is that we have weekly meditation, live meditation sessions that are happening each week, which are really, really wonderful, which are led by the Tergar facilitators, a really, really wonderful group of people. And we have Tergar instructors, and especially Mingyur Rinpoche himself, who will be giving a teaching every week as well. So please keep tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can go ahead and do so. That way you'll get updated about whatever's coming next. And if you want to share any final thoughts or anything that you found helpful here in the chat, or any final questions, we can always answer that in the comment section beneath the video. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an honor and a privilege to spend this time with you, and I wish you the best of luck in your meditation practice and in the rest of your life. So take care, everybody.